has agreed to come and talk to us a little bit about this program, about his thoughts on what it means to know that there's a group of men waking him up every Friday morning down here in the rectory. He's been with us since this program's inception, has been really one of the biggest cheerleaders for us, inspirers for us, and we thought this was just kind of an appropriate moment to ask him to come here and share some thought with us about what he's seeing with this program.
Thanks. So after Yahweh led the Israelites across the desert to the Promised Land, and then remember Moses died and Joshua led the Israelites into the Promised Land, they started getting rid of all the inhabitants, the Canaanites, the Hittites, all the ites, right? And the Israelites said, and then Joshua dies, and the Israelites said, somebody needs to take us on from here. And Yahweh says, okay, how about I send you prophets and spiritual leaders? And the Israelites said, no thanks, we'd like to have ourselves a king. And God said, you know what happens when you guys are subjects to kings. Nah, we'll be fine. Let's have some kings. And God said, fair enough. So he sends them kings, some good kings, some bad kings, most bad kings. And after a while, the Israelites slipped back into some of their idol worship and that sort of thing. And as predicted, God had to set things right, so he starts sending prophets. And one of the greatest of the prophets was Elijah. Elijah was a simple country farm boy. He was a farmer. He was a shepherd. Minding his own business, God comes to him and says, Elijah, I want you to go to the Israelites, tell them to knock it off, and get back on the straight and narrow. And Elijah, predictably, runs in the opposite direction. And so God tells him to travel into the desert and go to the broom tree, a broom tree in the middle of the desert, and there he will wait for 40 days while angels bring to him bread and water. And after 40 days, God says to Elijah, now go to the mountainside, and I will reveal to you, and then you will do exactly what I tell you to do. And so Elijah says, okay. He goes to Horeb. He climbs to the top of Mount Horeb, and then God comes to him. The Lord said, Elijah, go outside and stand on the mountain before the Lord. The Lord will be passing by. A strong, heavy wind was rending the mountains and crushing the rock before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire there was a tiny whispering sound. And when he heard this, Elijah hid his face in his cloak and went and stood at the entrance of the cave. For it was then that the Lord, the God of hosts, was passing by. And the message there for Elijah and for all of us, I think, in the course of our spiritual growth, our spiritual transformation, and as we embrace our vocations as dads and husbands and priests, oftentimes it's hard to find the Lord in monumental events like earthquakes and fires, and God's more than likely not going to come to visit us. Right? He's not going to reveal himself through some kind of epiphany or theophany or something like that. Right? And usually there's no single one event that we're really convinced of God's presence among us. What is more than likely, and what has been my own experience in my own spiritual life and my relationship with God, is that the Lord has made himself known to me in tiny whispering sounds. Almost imperceptibly. And often after much hindsight, do I realize that that was a moment where God was making his presence known to me. And more often than not, it was through another person or through an experience I had, or through a moment of peace and calm and prayer. Very rarely was it ever something earth-shattering, like an earthquake or a fire. And I guess what I'd like to offer us as we continue on this journey is just a word of perseverance and a word of encouragement. It might not feel like 11 weeks on anything is happening. There's no earthquakes, there's no fires. Maybe there's a fire at your house, right? But what is more than likely is that somewhere deep inside of each and every one of us, there's that tiny whispering sound. And of course, the reality is that He's always whispering to us. We just have to quiet down so we can hear. And that's what I think this journey is all about. And really, any spiritual journey. This is what any retreat is about. I know a bunch went on the White House retreat, huh? That's what White House is all about, huh? To quiet down, to slow down, to hear that tiny whispering sound that the Lord is constantly and consistently whispering to us. And I think we as men, as we try to incorporate all that culture gives us about masculinity, as we confront our own dimensions of what it means to be man and dad and husband and pal and colleague, we try to integrate all of that, we try to take all of that and then process that, internalize that, and then try to hear that still small voice whispering to us. And that still small voice is saying the same thing to each and every one of us. You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. The Father said it about His Son, Jesus, and He says it about each and every one of us. Craig Thomas, you are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased.